We open up our slides, and again, continuing on slide 17, we left off talking about sampling, again, taking that overall population. If I want to study hotel general managers' opinions on something, right, on any research topic I have, then am I going to go about it in a probability or a non-probability method in terms of deciding who I'm going to talk to and how many of them I'm going to talk to. So we've talked about these over a couple different class periods, and that's where we last left off. So again, on our methods worksheet, you have to decide who your population and your sample is, and that's part of the conversation we'll have next week. But moving forward, you've got a couple other sections of that methods worksheet you need to be able to answer. In addition to your textbook resources, let me talk about those pieces now. So sample size considerations, again, who's that sample going to be? Again, now based on the situations we're facing in our environment and world, that may change, hence the reason for my email suggesting you can either continue with your research topic or move to a research study that we'll do on COVID-19 because of the priority it's taken in the world, but it's certainly taken its tremendous toll on the tourism industry. So sample size will always be based on your research objectives, certainly your cost, time, access to that market, right? Response rate, objectives, as I've said, and then which method you're going to use, a probability type method or a non-probability method like snowball effect or cluster sampling or purposeful, expert, right? That kind of idea, quota. So based on all those, and again, we've talked about that, we're going to move forward and we're talking about instrument development. So on Blackboard, I ask that you upload just a photo of your cover page from the questionnaire critique. That critique was to look at what the problem, statement, and objectives were for a study and what you believe to be the collection method. In addition, I just asked that you show me one sample of an instrument that you identified things you liked or didn't like. Similar to what we did in class, in our last class period, where we actually worked on the first instrument. And if you remember, we did a nice job critiquing the equestrian study. And again, garbage in is garbage out. If you could work this really hard to get to this point and then develop an instrument that's not going to measure what you want it to measure, that's going to be a problem. So we want to talk about the different types of measurement and then what you do now. How do you actually develop an instrument? And first, we're going to talk about the four kind of subsets that questions fall into. And what we know is the question you ask evokes different types of data. So you actually have to think simultaneously, what is it I want to know? What objective do I have? And what questions do I need to ask to answer that objective? Could be one question, it could be 10 questions, could be a lot of questions. But what are the question or questions I need to ask to solve my objective or answer that objective? And then which way do I want to ask it? Because what is it I want to understand? And I'll show you some examples right now, and I hope that makes better sense. Again, don't forget textbook reading about questions. Don't forget, I got a whole handout in Blackboard on developing survey questions. And then there's lots of resources online to help you be better at developing questions. I don't ever hope that you would ever develop something like this. I know you have the ability, even based on your critique of that, to be much better. So let's talk about the first level of measurement, and that's called nominal data or nominal-oriented questions. And really, there's no quantitative data you're going to get from these, and what you're really going to find out is how are people grouped. And some of the more obvious type questions are gender. Right? There's no mean score you're going to get. There's no average, right? You're just trying to find out how many people fell into what category, and then I want to represent and share that feedback with the audience I'm sharing the data with. It may also be what industry are you employed in, right? Are you in the lodging industry? Are you in meeting and events? Are you in attraction work, etc.? So these types of questions are called nominal because there's no statistical data, quantitative data you're going to pull from those responses. But what you are going to be able to do with these questions is do amazing comparisons. For example, we may have data on understanding the quality of a work environment is for employees. in the tourism industry overall. But because I've asked questions like this, I can now do a comparison by industry. So maybe people, my hypothesis or my research question is, are people in different aspects of our industry, do they think about the quality of work life at in these different businesses differently? Does a hotelier think differently than a restaurant employee, etc.? So because I've asked these nominal questions, I can slice and dice, I call it, right? But I can split the data into categories to make and have a better understanding of what my objective really was, and to see if there was a difference between genders, to see if there's a difference between other levels of education, to see if there's a difference between work title, right? Those kinds of issues. So that's called nominal data. Ordinal data assigns a value based on a rank order, kind of implying that this comes, then this comes, then this comes, then this comes. But it doesn't necessarily formalize a quantitative difference. It doesn't mean because it orders in this order that the distance between each of those is equal. So in that way, ordinal data may end up something like what we call the official Likert scale. A Likert scale is making statements to people to react to. So we call this scale, can be 5 or 7 points. Actually, it can be anywhere between 4 and 7 points, 4, 5, 6, or 7, going from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So it's very traditional on a 5-point scale. You see there's 6 points here because this is an uncertain category. So 5 points with the scale itself here again, strongly agree to strongly disagree, that people are having to respond to these corporate social responsibility statements. Volunteerism is encouraged in my organization. Do you agree with that statement? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, etc. So it doesn't say, it implies in this scale that it would be kind of equal between, but it doesn't prove that. It doesn't give a numerical value to do it. So that is called ordinal data. So again, remember Likert scale, very common in our industry and others, right? These types of questions. You may decide to write questions that force people to react to statements to understand their agreement through disagreement on that. Similar to that, it's called interval data, but now interval data says no, there's a balance between those spaces in order. So there's a value assigned to the magnitude of that difference, and that's a similar base, right? Based on a uniform scale of measurement, and they can be mathematically manipulated. Meaning officially, in an ordinal scale, I can only say X% of people strongly agreed. In an interval scale, what I can do, if you've assigned a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and told me what those mean, I can actually not only tell you X% of people said 1, I can tell you the mean score of that overall question is 2.5, right? So I can look at it mathematically. So very common in our industry, again, that we'll see a question that says, how satisfied are you with anything in our business? And it would go from extremely satisfied to not at all satisfied. And there's an implication here that we can assign a value of 1 through 5. Meaning there's a balance between those. There's satisfied or neutral in the middle, and then 2 extremes on the other end. Again, the rule of thumb of developing questionnaires, and I've never read anything that suggests otherwise. If you're going to develop a scale, it has to be a 4-point, 5-point, 6-point, or 7-point scale. And part of that reason is anything lower than 4, so a 3-point scale, doesn't give you enough distinction. Or enough items to value. Like you can go from very satisfied to not so satisfied, but you'll never hit not at all satisfied, right? And conversely, a 10-point scale, which is something we see more commonly, a 10-point scale gives you too much variability and there's no distinction for people. Like what's the difference between a 3 and a 4, really? So 10-point is commonly a mistaken scale. I think most people, or people that use those 10-point scales, are probably thinking along like a percent, 100%, 10 represents, every 10%. Then people do a 7, they think it's 70%. But there's no research, text, data, information that I've ever found that suggests a 10-point scale is the proper way to write one. It's either 4, 5, 6, or 7. Now, I tend to be a 5-point scale person because you as the researcher gets to decide. And the reason I like a 5-point scale is I like people to be able to what I call sit on the fence. You want to sit in the middle, kind of neutral, satisfied in the middle, you can. Some people don't like people to sit on the fence, as I call it. They push them either way, right? So if it's a 4-point scale, I'm either going to have to go towards the negative or toward the positive. I'm not allowed to sit right in the middle. So I've used both types of scales depending on the type of question I'm asking, but I'm more common to use a 5-point scale to give people that choice. And that's, again, I'm the researcher for my research studies. I get to decide. You're the researcher for your research study, and you get to decide. So that's, again, called an interval scale. Very, very common. And in several of the methods that we talked about, we would more than likely use an interval type scale in that example. Age is another area that I tend to ask. Um, Many people ask it interval oriented, where they put categories, and I'll show you an example in a couple minutes. But I tend to ask age in any question that's just as easy to answer as an open-ended response as it is to check a box. I ask as an open-ended response. And that's just for the reason I said earlier, that every question that's asked is going to give different types of information statistically back. And I choose as a researcher to get as much data as I can, and I can organize it in different ways. So in this case, when I ask age as an open-ended question, I get someone's actual age, and I can do two things with that. One is I can develop a mean score based on everybody's age, add them up, divide by the number of people, and I get it, right, the average age of the population of people, or the sample of people in my population that responded. If I ask it in categories, so I say between 16 and 26, check here, between 27, right, etc., check here, between 30, check here. If I do that, I will never know the actual age of my respondents, and I could never calculate a mean score. I will only be able to report what we call frequency data, and I would only be able to say that X% of our people fall between 16 and 26 years of age. I can do that and get a mean if I have it as an open-ended question. And what some of the literature, it's so common to see it as categories, yet you lose so much information that I choose, again, to ask it this way, because it's just as easy to type in my age as it is to find the box I fall into. And if it's not going to change time or be more convenient, I'm going to take the way to ask a question is to get more information. So there's my age story. The last area, the fourth area of questions, are called ratio questions, and they actually have what they call a true 0 point, or I like more referring it to as a character of origin, meaning a start point. So height and weight are common ratio variables, certainly asked in our industry, but I would say overall, lots of nominal questions, certainly some ordinal questions, but a lot of interval questions tend to be more common. And then again, depending ratio as well. I love this chart. There's the site for the source of that chart is below. And what I like about it is it kind of proves what I was just saying, that different types of information produces different data and insight we can garner from that. You can get mode from all 4 types of questions, but you can only get median from 3, and you can only get mean from 2 because of how they're like. So recognize this table suggests, again, different questions we ask in different ways, evokes different types of information depending on how you ask it. So you've critiqued those sample questionnaires. We've looked at them. Now you need to develop your own. You've seen some of the good, some of the bad, and let me talk about a few more of them here. But I really want you to recognize that it's not an easy process, but it's going to be really rewarding when you get done. We have lots of samples on Blackboard with student research that have gone through a multi-level process, return, and you do need to draft your questionnaire before you and I meet next week. So with that, you always start with your objectives, because the objectives drives everything. Instruments are dependent on those. It's dependent on the type of method. If you want to do a focus group, you're going to develop research questions you're going to ask during your focus group process. You'll always use the literature as part of the decision. You may You may modify someone else's instrument. You may replicate someone else's instrument with their permission, right? But you might want to test exactly how someone else has found results to be, and you want to test it the same way. You may follow, again, an instrument that way. So literature, type of method, your research objective or your research questions, and recognizing those 4 different types of questions I just mentioned are going to evoke different types of data. So I take all those things into consideration as I develop my instrument. And what you initially planned a couple weeks ago may be different than what you're actually going to do today based on our world and the environment, etc. So again, access to the sample is part of that, and things have changed. So you may have to change some of the ways that you thought about gathering data. So again, keep in mind, you're going to start with your objectives. You're going to then decide the methodology, right? The collection method you're going to use. If I'm going to use an online survey method like SurveyMonkey, then I'm also going to use my literature review to then develop my questions. And in my case here, I want this interval question so I can do, you remember, I know you do, both mean and frequency. So I can look at that data a lot of different ways. So what's wrong with this question? Let's take a look at it and just kind of finalize at least some discussion here. And in this example, the city of Grand Rapids should pursue the development of a new indoor family recreation and senior citizen center. Question. It's a Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. What's the problem? Well, I hope you came up with the fact, and we didn't talk about this yet, so that's why I'm bringing it to you, is the fact that they're really looking at 2 different things. And by the time you were done with the data, I mean, I have something I'm analyzing and I'm like, oh, 70% of the people strongly disagree with this. But what are they really disagreeing with? The idea of having an indoor family recreation center or a senior citizen center? So by rule of thumb, when I write a question, even with my own instruments, is I always look back and look at my ands. And if my ands indicate 2 things, I need to split that into 2 questions. So and, red flag, right? Double check when you write your instrument. And if it's asking 2 things, just separate it into 2 questions. This could have easily been a matrix where we asked, as in the earlier example, strongly agree across the row, column of items to, right, look at. You could have asked several things to have people react to quite quickly. And I can show you how to do that, not only in SurveyMonkey, but it provides a good framework of how to do that otherwise. Here's question 2. What's wrong with this? On a scale of 1 to 10, please rate the following activities in terms of their importance to members of your household. 1 equals very important, 10 equals not at all important. I bet you have this one already, but I wanted you to think. It's the scale, right? 1 to 10, very common mistake in survey research, and we've already talked about it. Question 3, what's wrong with this? What is your age? There's actually 2 things wrong with this, and only 1 thing did I talk or at least suggest to you a little earlier. And the one issue is what we call mutually exclusive. If I was 28 years old, I would have 2 places to check, and you then would have data that you wouldn't know how to analyze because you don't know really what category I belonged in. So you want to be careful of no overlap if you're going to use categories like this. And we call that making sure your respondent, if you're only asking them to check 1 thing, has only 1 thing they could check. If you want them to check multiple boxes, you just need to indicate that. And it certainly isn't appropriate in this question, but it certainly may be in another question. Check all that apply, all the things you're interested in doing when you go on vacation. And if that's the case, you just need to tell them they can check all they apply. In this case, it wouldn't have been important, or not only not important, it also would have been a big mistake. The second thing about this is an issue called if I was 70 years old, you didn't have a place for me at all. And we call that collectively exhaustive. And collectively exhaustive simply means, have you identified all the possibilities for someone to answer? They're not overlapping like mutually exclusive is, but they're not exhaustive of all the things I may say. So they're a very common way to make sure you've covered your bases is to include other in that description. Even, for example, I asked you to click on a link so I could get an understanding of the current environment or situation you were facing. And I wasn't sure in a couple of the questions if I covered my bases, so I included other. And right away, I had a few people that had already responded with other comments that I would have lost the richness and the real understanding of the information if I didn't have other there. So, other is a fabulous way to capture, to make sure we've been exhaustive of all possibilities when someone responds. Okay, so here we go. The information I've just shared was designed to continue our discussion or thinking about developing questionnaires or instruments. The questions, mostly quantitative in nature. What we didn't talk about are qualitative type questions. We briefly did the day we were talking about focus groups or observation, but I'm going to work with you one-on-one if those are the methods that you pick. Knowing that quantitative data is so prevalent in our industry, I want to make sure you leave the class this semester seeing how to do it, understanding how to do it, because and even in this case, I've written 3 research studies in the last 48 hours just to understand what's happening and provide resources for people as a result. So other things we have to consider under methodology is information about your cover letter. And I call it a cover letter, but I really mean directions or instructions, introduction to what we're doing, partly related to your city certification. And again, if you haven't finished your certification, you need to do so by next week so you're able to go and collect data. Please let me know if you have questions about that. But I want to talk about the cover letter here. I want to talk about pilot testing, and then validity and reliability, and then finally limitations. Once I'm done with that, you should have, and you should have had, because we've talked about it either in class or now, the ability to answer all of the questions in that box as it relates to your study. So cover letters with the instrument being the questionnaire. Could be the observation, could be the interview, could be the focus group, whatever. But what does that cover letter need to include? We've talked about this, but I wanted at least to give you a sample here. A well-written cover letter is going to cover multiple issues. It's going to, again, explain the purpose of the project, providing clear directions of what to do next. Click here, right? Click below. Wait for the researcher to distribute the questionnaire, whatever the directions are next, what happens next. If possible, you want to personally address the person. Again, we talked about that in terms of Dillman's protocol before. You'll have a higher response rate. If there's a deadline or a date you need the information by, you should provide that. In the case of our situation, because we're in a short time frame turn with a class, you may suggest that to the person you've sent that to. You may offer to send a summary of the results as an incentive, since again, we have limited resources of what we can do. And you want to, if you're going to guarantee I can never say the word, making it anonymous. That's awful. I can never say that word. If you want to guarantee it being anonymous, then it better be anonymous. You better not be able to track that person back. But 100% of the time, you can maintain confidentiality because, again, we don't want the person's name or any contact information, any way we can connect them back to the information. You're going to consolidate it and present it in aggregate as a group, not as an individual, right? And you'll always maintain as a researcher, as an ethical researcher, confidentiality. We want to make sure we cover the institutional review board, right? City certification type issues, and many of those are addressed earlier. One of those not mentioned is just that the process is voluntary. You're not coercing, you're not trying to intimidate anybody to participate. It's completely voluntary in nature. And you may need a personal signature authorizing that they've consented to that or other information, but you want to make sure that information is not connected to their responses at all. So whether it's two forms, two sheets, two things, but they can't be connected, as you know. And then an incentive we kind of talked about, and we've talked about Dillman's protocol ideas, sending it multiple times, etc. And we talked about that all several weeks ago. So what should the cover letter look like? Here's an example, right, taken right from the samples I put onto Blackboard of the students' research study. And you'll notice, again, condensed letter, well written, and there's a few things. It introduces who they are or you are, the researcher is, right? Explains why they're doing the study or the actual purpose of the study. And in this case, she wanted to understand how the community felt about having a large music festival in the community. What were the economic, environmental, and social impacts that it had on the community? Further, she said again, it was a voluntary process and all responses were confidential. She also indicated how long approximately it would take. Certainly when I read 3 minutes, that's a bigger incentive to take it than if something would be 13 minutes, right? So the appropriate nature of the instrument makes it more attractive for people to respond. And then a few of the other keys are making sure you provide information for the person to get a hold of you if they have questions, right? And that, again, that incentive in this case is a copy of the survey results if they wanted, and they can enter their email address in a separate form in this case. So some of those examples are some of those key components, shows you, again, a nice sample of what that is. But remember that every student has included that cover letter and their questionnaire in those research reports that are on Blackboard, so take a look at those. Pilot testing is another important aspect of developing your instrument and your cover letter. And by nature of it being a class, I am a logical pilot tester of your information when we meet next week. However, I encourage you to pilot test it with other people. Those people can be related to the subject group as long as it's not part of the sample. So for example, if I'm going to do a survey of general managers and I have a population of 100 in my geographic area, I decide I'm going to sample 25 of them to conduct interviews. I could take, of the remaining 75, I could ask a few of those general managers to actually take a look at my questionnaire and provide feedback about how they may respond because they're not in my sample, but they would be similar to the sample, right? So you'd want to know if items were clear and understandable. I actually asked people to tell me how long it took to respond. I want them to respond just like a real person would. And they can help identify some of those issues that we talked about earlier. Again, I have a stack in my office about that thick, the file of questionnaires that have things that could have been better that were used in our industry. So again, thrilled people are trying to gather data. We just want to make sure they're gathering good data, appropriate data, because garbage in is garbage out. And so once you get that feedback, and I always use a red pen, I give people a red pen and I just say, write right on it so I can see. You make the necessary changes to the instrument. For me, 100% of the time, 100% of the time, when I pilot test my instrument, I'm making some type of modification. Again, they're giving me feedback. I get to decide what I take and what I don't take. But 100% of the time, it's made it a better instrument. So it doesn't always have to be a person in that sample. It might be someone who just understands research. It might be someone who doesn't understand research at all or the sample, but you're just going to have them read it and understand it for what we call a face validity. Does it make sense? Does that make sense to you as a layman, as a person who isn't a general manager of a hotel? So multiple different types of pilot tests are really an exceptional way to develop a better instrument. And I think sometimes what happens in our industry is people are like ready to go. They've been working on this for a long time. They have the questionnaire. They just want to send it. And again, keep in mind, it's a really critical mistake because of some of those errors that might be found. Validity and reliability, as we look at that, it's in the textbook as well, but let me just talk about what we're really trying to understand. And I really want you to address this again in your method section. All of those sample method sections from surveys clearly identify validity and reliability issues in the instrument. So keep looking at those samples I gave you and just make sure you're addressing all of these sections. I have a little concern about some of the student reports on Blackboard because out of all the sections, this would be one I would like students to improve on, right, overall. So I'm hoping you will be the first group to really get it right. Valid instruments and processes simply means, is it meaningful? Is it really going to measure what it's supposed to measure? And we talk about internal validity, and what it's really saying with internal validity is, can we really say that this is why this happened? Are there any other variables that could have influenced this kind of outcome? Like, what else impacted the satisfaction of someone's work life? Did we measure supervisory skills? If we didn't measure that, then maybe we don't have the right internal validity, because we really haven't identified what are all the things that influence an employee being more satisfied at work than not. If we didn't talk about flexible hours or pay and benefits, if we didn't talk about um, uh, work-life conditions, right, the environment they work in, if we didn't talk about customers, all those things, do we really think that those things don't influence? You know, we know they do, because the literature told us to. So internal validity just makes sure you've covered all of the variables that may have impacted what's happening. I think of what's happening today in our world, and I think, you know, even though they're talking a recession now, you know, can we fully blame the recession on what's happened right here? Well, it certainly feels like it, like significantly, right? But there probably are other variables that influence that as well. Um, Again, it's almost so out of the ordinary. Well, it is out of the ordinary totally, so you can't even really articulate that well. But just meaning, think about all the things that influence things, and we got to make sure it's covered. That's internal validity. Content validity kind of relates to that, but it's really about the literature and having an understanding of, do you really understand this topic? So let me go back to quality of work life. Do I really understand all of the content areas that are important in quality of work life? And even if I'm just talking about human resource things like pay and benefits, but is there anything else within pay and benefits? Or do I know all of the benefits that are important to people or listed or available to people? The last list I had about 120 different benefits that people could check off and say, this is what we get from our organization or not. I mean, it was a monster list. And why was that important? Because that proved that we knew the content. We know the types of benefits all different organizations offer, but they all don't offer the same ones. So that was based on, again, having the literature background and making sure we knew all of the things that might influence that one thing, the content itself. And then face validity is what I already talked about. The fact that you do a pilot test is actually a face validity test. So by nature of our process, the fact that I for sure will look at your instrument, you automatically are using a face validity process. So I would expect that to be in your methods for certain, because it's already built into our system, right? But the others you've done as well. You've done a literature review. Do you feel like you have a small mastery of the content? And if you do, then that was part of, right, the process. So all of those are validity checks, meaning, was it meaningful? Are you right? Are you really, do you have your bases covered? Reliability means, is it consistent? If you replicated this study over again, would you find a similar result? If you asked that question over again, would you get a similar result? If you had someone doing your interviewing and they asked a person twice, right, would they ask it the same way? Those are all making sure consistency is in place. So what we call the trail of procedures is certainly one of the reliability steps I'm asking you to do. Your job is to make sure you tell us in detail all of the things you decided, but all of the things you did and what happened. For example, I sent out the instrument on April the 1st on 5 different Facebook homepages. Those Facebook, had a fan or follower base or friend base of um, mean of 450 people, right? And I sent it on those 5 on April the 1st. On April the 5th, I sent it out a second time. April 1st, I got 42 responses. April 5th, I got 23 more responses. That's part of the trail of procedures. In addition to what I planned, it's what actually happened. So I call it the roadmap or the detail section, that what All you need to do is make sure you get all those details down as you're doing them and what the results are along the way. Then you've done a reliability check. Someone could replicate that and see if they got a similar result. The process you use to select your sample, to collect and analyze data and report your findings, any of those processes you figured, if you used SPSS, if you used SurveyMonkey, if you've cleaned your data, right? If you've analyzed it using Excel and SPSS and SurveyMonkey, whatever you've done, the fact that you put 100 general managers' names into a big bowl and used a simple random probability sampling method, that's all part of what you need to tell the reader. Reliability coefficients. I've never had a student actually do these, and I've only done them on a few studies, but anytime you have a lot of questions, let's say we're saying attributes we want to measure in an importance performance analysis, and we take all of the attributes that are important to visitors when they go to a festival. And we've listed 20 items and we've asked them to rate them. We can check their consistency, meaning are they being honest? We can do that a couple different ways. I could take all of those scales and I can put them into a stats process or into SPSS, and I can test to see if the scales are reliable, meaning the way they've responded on those scales is reliable. They have a 0.7 or better, then we're good. They've been reliable. But the other way to do that is down low where it's called kind of test retest. And so I ask you to consider this method of reliability checks in a large scale. I could use that importance performance analysis again and have those 20 items. And what I would do is I would ask, the facility is clean, strongly agree to strongly disagree, or on a scale of 1 to 5, rate cleanliness, And then I may ask it a second time just to see at the bottom of those scales if they've been consistent in their response. Sometimes people think, oh my gosh, they've asked it twice. What they don't realize is it's really a check to make sure they're paying attention. Because if you're answering 20 scale items and you're trying to go down the list, you sometimes are fearful as a researcher. I shouldn't say sometimes, all the time, you're fearful to make sure people are paying attention and really reading what you're asking them to critique or to respond to. So we call that the test retest. Our researchers, people who write about this, call it test retest. The last area right above that is intra-rater and intra-rater, and I've already alluded to that, but it means that if I was sending 10 people out to observe mystery shopping practices in restaurants, as an example. I would want to make sure in my reliability discussion to tell how I've trained all of those 10 people to be very consistent in the way they observe what I'm asking them to observe. For example, I've given them all the same questionnaire. I've asked them to spend X amount of time observing, right? I've asked them not to engage or to engage, right, with people, but it's a consistent approach. Because if I have one person at a restaurant who's talking to the host, and I have another person at a restaurant not engaging with the staff, and yet they're evaluating the quality of the experience, it's already biased with two people's perspective and two different experiences. So we try to really isolate how they'll handle that if I'm going to have multiple people out there. Conversely, it's that double check to make sure if I observed the same place with two different people, would they see the same thing? And so one way to check that is to actually send two people to the same location at the same time and have them looking and observing, doing the research, right, to double check how fast was the host at greeting people, how fast did they get seated, how long did it take between ordering and getting the food out, whatever the items are that are being evaluated. Did both of those people view it the same way? One of the things we've already done in class when we analyzed at the beginning of the semester qualitative data is many of you looked at the same responses, you analyzed it, and it didn't come out identical. If it doesn't come out identical, then we have a reliability issue. You got the same information, you were asked to code it the same way. How did we get different results? So I would have to account for that in my research study and explain, if we got different results, what did we do to resolve that? Did we have two different people go and analyze that data then and then look at it all? Did we try and discuss how things were worded? Because maybe we coded things differently in categories, and we would have to be more consistent than that because we'd have to have a higher reliability. So in the case I stated, we put those on Google Docs, and like 85% of the class had the same 3 things. So I'm fairly confident based on that consistency, right, that those were the top 3 content areas that were covered in those qualitative questions. But I'd want to double check, because those 3, the 15% that saw something different or wrote something different, we'd want to double check why that happened, because the goal would have been everybody saw the same thing. Those are reliability issues, right? Consistency, consistency. It's a good day when everybody comes back saying the same 3 things were the top trends. Then you know it is what it says it is. So validity and reliability, not well represented in the sample student reports. We're trying to get better at that. Look at the sample method pages that I gave you and see how the industry addresses, because I want to know, when I read a research study, you've done these things. You've had your checks and balances. You've done your homework. This is a reliable process, right? And these are valid instruments and a valid way you've gone about doing this research. You've covered your bases. So that's part of the section. Limitations, a small section of this whole report, but I always say things go wrong, right? Or things happen. So one limitation, I pulled a couple student reports just to show you, but the fact that this researcher used her own Facebook page on a study of the community, right, had some limitations to it, and she addressed that in the study. The second study was that the survey actually had a mistake on it. The question had a mistake. I've had that happen too. And as a result, I couldn't use that question, but it was a limitation to the study, right, that I wasn't able to use that question, because you could tell the way they responded that, or the way I worded it, right, in that case. So I just want to show you those couple examples. The one that I've said at the beginning of the semester too is, when you say time is a limitation, it is always limitation. Now, it certainly is when you're in a class and you have no control over how quickly you need to collect data. You can't control the fact that what just happened to us, and you can't wait now 4 months to actually collect the data, right? We're still trying to practice it, at least. We've changed, how we're going to collect the data and the process, but the time is still the time. It's still a semester basis. However, life is time. Life is full of time, and time is always a limitation. So know that you don't need to put that here, because it's a given. What you're trying to identify are the legitimate decisions you made. How has that been limiting to the research process? The fact that 2 people responded, my response rate is a limitation to this, right? And even though you did XXXX, you've explained that in your methods, it still resulted in 2 people responding. So that's okay, certainly from a grade and a process. In fact, that really shows, and that's one of the things I want you to experience, is how difficult it is to get response rate kinds of, or just responses from certain types of respondents. But it might be a limitation, because that wasn't your goal, and it just didn't work like you thought it was going to. So welcome to research, right? So as we go. So those are types of limitations, and know they're important to identify. So this week, here's where we're at. I want you to develop your own instrument and learn SurveyMonkey. And those could be one and the same, or they could be 2 different things. Again, if you're doing a qualitative study, I've given you a couple qualitative methods pages that will help explain some qualitative questions. But if I'm going to do a focus group, I'm going to identify the 8 or 10 questions. I'm going to make sure that match my objectives, because my objectives drives everything in the research process. Hence the reason it's so important to have well written and understood objectives, because they're going to dictate everything. I also want you to click on that Google Doc. I did not have it editable, so I know a couple of you tried it, so thanks for letting me know that it wasn't editable, but it is now. And just fill in the time you want to meet with a number to reach you, and we'll have a phone call or a FaceTime or a Skype or whatever you want to do. And we want to go over your methods worksheet. What you're going to need to do is email me, or I'll have you upload to Blackboard, either or to give me your questionnaire link or your actual questionnaire, and we'll work on those things one-on-one. So don't worry about that. So problem statement and objectives, that's what we're working from. You're taking one at a time, and you're developing your instrument. So I want to understand the demographics of respondents. Here are the 4 questions I am going to ask, I put those into SurveyMonkey because those are the things I want to know about demographics. Second question, right? Learn about the economic impact. So what are the questions now I need to write to ask my sample that I would have a better understanding of what they think about economic impact? Maybe it's their feelings on it, their beliefs, right? Their attitude about how it impacts the economy locally. Maybe it's actually asking numbers, if I think the sample would have access to information, number of hours worked that week, so their paychecks go up, so make more money, right? Thinking, again, if I did a good job on my internal and content validity, I would know the types of questions I would want to ask about economic impact. And then I go to the next question, social impacts. Then I go back to the attendance patterns. Do they go to the festival? Have they ever gone to the festival? If they go to the festival, how often do they go? How long do they stay? Right? So that would be an important consideration. If they're a community member that goes to the festival, my hypothesis would be they'd have a different attitude about the festival than those who don't go. So we'd want to ask those questions. And then it goes on to environmental impacts and then their overall opinion of the festival. And again, might be one question I'm asking, it might be 10 questions in each one of those objectives. It all depends. So know we're going to work on those together, but you need to draft it first, doing due diligence, right? And those questions are the objectives that you have so we can move forward. And there we go. So with that,